influential Pulitzer Prize-winning book, blasting the West for its failure to act time and again on genocide. But like you said, she was with this UN delegation in Mali. They met with the president, and basically they came away warning that country, the government, to conclude talks with the rebels or face a big and present growing security threat. I began by asking her about that mission to Mali.
Madam Ambassador, you just got back from Mali. You were there on a fact-finding mission, and you met with the president there as well. The French President François Hollande has described the French intervention there as a success. From the tweets that you sent from there, it seems that Mali really has its work cut out, and that reconciliation and the insurgent threat is far from over.
Let me say two things. One, the people of Mali are overwhelmingly grateful to the people of France and the French president for the leadership France showed. I mean, if you think back a year and a half ago, or even 14, 15 months ago, I mean, the place was living under a reign of terror. You know, 2/3 of the country overrun by extremists, militants, amputations, the works. And France intervened and stopped that. And that's going to be something that people of Mali remember for a long time. You're right that Mali's at a bit of a crossroads now, in the sense that it's come off a wave, about a year of consistent progress, vanquishing the bad guys, holding presidential elections and electing President Keita, who's made a commitment to fighting corruption, ending impunity, et cetera. I mean, really pushing a governance agenda, legislative elections. But they've slipped behind a little bit on the negotiations with the armed groups, as was called for in the accord that brought the conflict to an end.
The French cannot do it alone in Mali. They've made it clear they don't want to do it alone. They expect support. Is the U.S. in any way willing to step up with logistical or other forms of help in Mali?
We're already, providing intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, et cetera, support. We're doing air refueling for French flights and so forth, and we're training and equipping some of the troop-contributing countries that are deploying as part of the UN force. I think we all recognize that, particularly as the French redistribute their presence across the Sahel, drawing down a little bit from Mali and reallocating, we want to just strengthen the cooperation and the support that we offer, whether in terms of intelligence sharing, again, which is so important as we think about dealing with terrorism in that region, or in terms of lift and whatever the French might need to move their forces around. So we're looking at a whole host of things that we might do to support.
Madam Ambassador, the Geneva II peace talks on Syria are in an interim period right now. Critics say they were over before they even started. They didn't even manage to get humanitarian aid convoys through to the besieged town of Homs. Now, you're on the UN Security Council, a very influential voice on that council. Is there going to be a UN Security Council resolution to force that aid through to the refugees in need?
Well, let me just say, I think Geneva showed actually how credible and capable the opposition is. Of course, we're working with them, as is the French government, to try to support their efforts to come together to represent all of the people of Syria. I think you saw the regime, and the regime was exposed, not that it needed to be exposed after 3 years of slaughter, but for the obstructionist actor that they are, obstructionists on the transitional governing body, but obstructionists also on something as basic as sending food parcels to children and women living in besieged areas. We are looking at a whole host of options now, I think, in New York for how we can step up the pressure on the regime, since clearly sitting down at the table and being called upon by the United States, by Russia, by all of the countries that were gathered, was not enough to cause them to lift their barbaric sieges on these towns.
You have pointed the finger of blame squarely at the Russians for obstructing all efforts to force Bashar Assad to step down. Do you see the Security Council under these circumstances as being essentially dysfunctional, and what sort of reform would you like to see?
We saw it work on chemical weapons, and that shows it can be made to work, where Russia brings the will to bear, the will to put pressure on the Assad regime, who it has tremendous leverage over, and the will to put the force of international law behind it. I think one of the reasons the people of Syria are so frustrated is they say, how come you can get a resolution out of the Security Council on chemical weapons and you can't do that to feed innocent people who did nothing more than basically come out and say they want human rights. And that frustration is completely understandable. But we are drawing and have been seeking to draw on the chemical weapons precedent to push Russia to use the leverage it has with the regime.
Have you seen any shift in the attitude of the Russian ambassador to the United Nations? Presumably you meet with him quite frequently. Do you see any signs that perhaps they are changing their stance?
I think that I certainly think that the ambassador is interested in New York in finding out where a spigot can be opened. I think he operates, let's say, in good faith to sort of fact find and understand where Russia can use its influence. But I think we will know when Russia has put the full weight of the relationship behind it when we see these sieges lifted.
You're a passionate human rights defender, former journalist. You've been very outspoken on the issue of genocide. You wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the West's repeated failures to stop genocide. When we look at the Central African Republic today, some people say that is a genocide waiting to happen. What do you propose to do about that?
Well, first again, hats off to President Hollande for sending French troops in there when the threat of genocide loomed. This is not necessarily a politically popular mission for him to have undertaken, but he did it with the welfare of the Central Africans in mind. And the French forces are doing a tremendous job on the ground in coordination now with the African forces. We got to get more African forces in there. The European Union has stepped up now with a commitment of 500 or 600 troops. Deploying them quickly is going to be very important. And then figuring out what we do next, whether this gives rise to a UN peacekeeping mission. The Central African state has basically vanished. And it's not sustainable for the international community to be the finger in the dike. We have got to work together, and again, through the United Nations civilian side and political mission, to build out the state again and to ensure that the people have the leadership they need. We're focused on supporting the African troops on the ground at this time.
That's U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Power, there, interviewed by our International Affairs editor, Douglas Herbert, earlier today. Doug, a lot of interesting stuff in that interview. Let's focus on Mali. We were talking about Mali earlier. There, she seemed to be very clear. The U.S. will help, but it will not be sending troops anytime soon.
Yeah, there's nothing earth-shattering revelation in that. We have known that the U.S. has not been in a mindset recently following its other Middle Eastern war adventures or misadventures to get bogged down in another conflict. Its troops on the ground are out of the question for the U.S. And as we've seen, even with the Libya campaign with Muammar Gaddafi, it's mostly the U.S. has been focusing its efforts, as she said, on recon, on intelligence, on air refueling, on surveillance, trying to help out in that sort of more technical intel capacity on the ground. The troops, no boots on the ground, and in a sense, you get the sense with the United States right now, it's very happy to I'm not going to say take a back seat, but it's leading from behind, as Barack Obama once phrased it, but to let the French sort of in this what is considered sort of the French domain. You can imagine in Washington they sit there saying, let the French handle that right now with the Africans. They're doing a good job. We are not sending troops in, but we will help in any way we can with the intelligence.
Now, also, she sounded very frustrated with the UN Security Council when it comes to the situation in Syria.
Yeah, listen, she's now a diplomat. She used to be, a journalist, much more of a firebrand on human rights issues and very passionate about genocide issues. She is not going to start poo-pooing the Russian ambassador to the UN, on camera like that. She has to be diplomatic in her new role. But I did get a sense, speaking to her, there's obviously a frustration, and especially when I asked her pointedly the question about they didn't even manage to get those humanitarian aid convoys through to homes. All they had to do, the convoys were waiting, get them through. There was a sense of frustration there. She obviously needs to keep a working relationship with her Russian counterpart, and she's, as you heard her say, she says he's operating in good faith. He is trying to find solutions, but I think, behind the scenes, at the end of the day, and she's been very clear about this, she's definitely frustrated, and she's been a proponent of reform of the UN Security Council in the sense of she perhaps thinks it should take on more members. There's even been talk, not explicitly from her, of replacing the veto. We've seen the Russian veto on Syria several times with majority voting, so that one member couldn't simply block the will of the so-called international community. But at the end of the day, the Security Council itself, not as it stands, a post-war institution which hasn't really changed at all, it doesn't really represent, it isn't the best way perhaps of doing business in this very, very globalized world right now.
All right, thank you for that. Douglas Herbert, International Affairs Editor here at France 24, who interviewed the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Power. Thank you. All right, coming up for you on France 24, talking cars are no longer pure science fiction. The U.S. is pushing for new ways to let vehicles warn each other if they're heading for a crash. More on that coming up after the break.